Hi, everyone. My name is Lori Wasselchuk. I am the Assistant Director of Public Programs at PAFA. And I am super glad to have you join us for this Art at Noon. It's a program that we offer at lunch hour on a Wednesday when they're kind of irregularly scheduled since I've taken over the programming here, but it seems to be working out. And we are super excited today to have the team part of the team that created Reckoning and Repair, the art that's touched Philadelphia. It's a podcast that connected to our current exhibition, Rising Sun, Artists in an Uncertain America. And I guess I'm going to hear a little bit more about how you got connected. But it was created by the Center for Experimental Ethnography, and we have Alyssa Jordan with us today. And I just wanted, before I introduce Alyssa, I wanted to talk a little bit about the way PAFA and AAMP have collaborated with the Center for the Experimental Ethnography throughout Rising Sun, which opened in March. Before the exhibition opened, students from Penn collaborated in a class, right, Alyssa, with Saya Wolfach, one of the exhibiting artists, and they created public-facing, after taking a whole semester talking about the way Saya works and how she engaged with the Rising Sun themes. Her work is called "We Emerge at the Sunset of Your Ideology," and the students then worked through these issues and created their own public-facing installations that was in the PAFA Rotunda for 2 days. The students were there and they interacted with the public, and it was an extraordinary experience. Yeah, I can say that it was an extraordinary experience to have these students here, to see their work, to see the results and how hard they put things together. And then the same is true for the podcast. It's a 12-episode podcast, right? 12 episodes. And it is very powerful. It digs deeply into themes of the exhibition, but also the issues surrounding art making, museum holdings, and the way we interact with arts today. I want to introduce Alyssa, who is the Assistant Director of the Center for Experimental Ethnography. Alyssa Jordan is an anthropologist, activist, and media maker living in Philadelphia. She is the Associate Director of the CEE at the University of Pennsylvania, and her research is focused on embodiment, sacred arts, and reproductive justice in Haiti and Ghana. Welcome, Alyssa.
Thank you so much, Lori, and thanks for having us and for the podcast creators being here with us. I'm so excited to hear from you guys. I'm just going to open with the same questions that were really of interest to us in opening these conversations with artists and art institutions in Philadelphia. That includes, how do artists and organizers in Philadelphia confront the troubling histories of empire in their midst? Is it even possible for colonially based art institutions to meaningfully reckon with their own exclusionary histories? And what models of reckoning and repair already exist in Philadelphia's art world? The Center for Experimental Ethnography was founded in 2018, and these questions were really important to us, given that we are stationed within the Penn Museum as part of the academic wing of anthropology. As an institute, we believe that multimodal research practices transform how we conduct research, how we generate and disseminate knowledge, how we train students, and how we remain accountable to the communities in which we interact and through which our research circulates. We see creative practice as intellectual work that necessarily historicizes the inequalities that pervade our society and that develops solutions for their present iterations through collaborative and participatory work like the podcast you're about to hear about. A basic premise that underlies our efforts is the contention that an expanded and multimodal definition of what counts as scholarly research will help lead to a more diverse university community in which artistic practice is a cornerstone not only for engaged and participatory democracy and social justice, but also for the reimagining and transformation of the university as a whole. Okay, so that's about the center. Now what I want to think about is the way that art has long been revered as a mirror reflecting society's joys, struggles, and triumphs. It's an ever-present force in human society that shapes and is shaped by the historical narratives of the social world it inhabits. Yet behind the vibrant canvases, sculptures, and performances that make up contemporary arts, there is a complex interplay of power dynamics and exclusionary histories. Art institutions, including the one in which we inhabit here at the Center for Experimental Ethnography, are often viewed as bastions of culture and enlightenment, but they've not been immune to perpetuating exclusions that mirror broader social injustices and accentuate them. For as long as these institutions and societies have been excluding classes of people from participating fully and democratically based on race, gender, ability, sexuality, documentation status, or economic background, these same excluded people and others have been speaking out against that. So the need for reckoning is really not a new idea, but in recent decades, there's finally and thankfully been increasing recognition of that need of historical reckoning and repair within art institutions, universities themselves. To begin thinking through the exclusion of Black artists and Indigenous artists is now something that I'm grateful to say is becoming a persisting concern. Art has the transformative potential to challenge dominant narratives, to amplify marginalized voices, and to serve as a catalyst for change. By engaging with excluded histories, artists can create spaces for dialogue, introspection, and collective healing. That's the promise. Art institutions, as gatekeepers of culture, have a responsibility to actively work with these artists and with these social justice workers and creatives and activists in all their different iterations towards redress, inclusion, and healing. And that's why we were so excited as a center to be invited into the monumental collaborative and ongoing effort between the African American Museum of Philadelphia and PAFA for the exhibit Rising Sun, Artists in an Uncertain America, which deals precisely with these sorts of questions, exclusions, and the possibilities of repair. In the course that we took, that I want to say that we participated in together, students were able to choose artists from PAFA and AAMP's roster of participating artists, as well as community organizations and other artists who'd worked in Philadelphia on these issues to engage with. They conducted background research on those artists and organizations. They held multiple interviews and then edited, group critiqued, and produced their own episodes for the launch of the Reckoning and Repair podcast. Through this project, they learned about oral history and podcasting as crucial tools through which scholars can explore and present the relationship between art, history, and power. So Reckoning and Repair as a whole explores art spaces in the city, from those built to forge community and care in the wake of exclusionary histories to older institutions that have been reimagining what it means to be an art institution today, given colonial frameworks that have guided the collection and exhibition practices over the past few centuries. Each of the 12 15-minute episodes features a richly experimental oral history with an artist, organizer, or curator. And it also, as a whole, I think, provides an exciting model of audio narrative. That's really what the students produced in it, that mixes micro stories, sonic memoryscapes, and poetic interludes. And these were all created over 3 months of conversation between Penn students and artists and organizers. And it represents really an ongoing collaboration with PAFA that has extended over the past few years, and which I'm really excited to see where it goes in the future. So I'm just going to briefly say one sentence about each podcast episode in case one of them strikes you as worth listening to. All of them are. The first of the 15-minute episode, Telling Our Own Stories, features memories and reflections by MacArthur Prize-winning documentary filmmaker and activist Louis Messiah, in conversation with Kristlyn Laurie Leroy, who's going to be the first one that we speak with today. The second episode, Bodies in Flux, Self-Portraiture Outside the Canvas, is an experimental storytelling episode with Saya Wolfach, in conversation with Wang Yao. Episode 3, The Urgency of Art and Life, is an oral history by trans-Ghanaian artist and activist Vabene Elikem Fiatzi, in conversation with Anya Miller, who joins us today. Episode 4, And I Listen to the Robin Sing, is a meditative oral history with multimedia artist Shada Soleimani that includes recordings of her bird and her bird rehabilitation center that's presented in conversation with Angel Gutierrez. Crafting Black Survival and Joy Through Time and Space is a wonderful jaunt with artist Emily Karras Duncan and host Katleho Kano Shoro. Some Histories Are Not Beautiful is episode 6. That's an oral history with Shwarga Barasharji, hosted by Hakima Abdul Fattah. And then The Question of Home is Complicated is episode 7, where we hear recollections on home, belonging, and curation with Tausif Noor, hosted again by Angel Gutierrez. And Life Like Fragile Clay offers a vivid depiction of practice through sculptor Arlene Sheshet's oral history. That's hosted by Rachel Borthwick. Hakima Abdul Fattah also records To Call a City Home with Aisha Khan, who is the founder of 12 Gates Art. And we hear from Christina Vasallo and Katie Perry of the Fabric Workshop and Museum in an episode with Jean Lieberman titled Connection, Collaboration, and Conflict. In episode 11, we hear from Dejay Duckett in Rising Sun, for the lead curator of Rising Sun, Artists in an Uncertain America, and the vice president of curatorial services at AAMP, in conversation with Hakima Abdul Fattah. And that episode has actually been excerpted in a recent article about the podcast. And in the final episode, we hear a 3-way conversation on labor, art, and care with former PAFA curatorial fellow Juan Omar Rodriguez and former PAFA manager of exhibitions and interpretation, Ellie Clark, hosted by Adriana Brusi, who's here with us today. So thank you for bearing with me. I just wanted to make sure that everyone who was there or everyone who participated got some credit. So first of all, I'm just so excited to be able to share with you the specific work, conversation, and perspectives of 3 of the podcast creators who are here: Chrislyn Laurie Leroy, Adriana Brusi, and Anya Miller. Chrislyn is a William Fontaine Fellow studying the public memory and history of slavery, particularly its curation in museums, monuments, memorials, and archaeological sites. She's interested in the biopolitical economy of African diaspora heritage tourism and its effects on contemporary Black identities and nationalisms. Adriana is a writer and organizer and student at the University of Pennsylvania studying art history and cultural anthropology. She's also the editor-in-chief of Tart magazine, and their work focuses on contemporary queer and Latinx art. Recently, she curated the exhibition Resilience, Art and Design in Times of Uncertainty, featuring young artists from throughout the Philadelphia area. It was a fabulous exhibit. Anya Miller is a 2023 Fulbright Fellow and a recent graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, where she studied sociology and design. More importantly, she's a student of life on a radical journey of learning and unlearning each and every day. As a human and as a scholar, Anya is passionate about the intersection of art and activism, public art and spatial production, ethnographic research, podcasting and photography, social justice curation, and intersectionality. And she really uses those interests because of her participation in the course and her work in the course, she was able to go on and create the 2nd season of Reckoning and Repair, which is going to be coming out next March and features oral histories in a very similar vein with artists from Argentina. So without further ado, welcome you guys. First, I want to give a second for each of you to just introduce a little bit about your episode and what you learned in the process. First, I'm going to turn to Chrislyn. If you just want to introduce your work with Louis Messiah, that would be fantastic.
Sure. Thank you, Alyssa. I'll just start by saying that it was an immense honor to get to sit down with Louis and talk to him about his art making practice and also his community activism. The summer I had first moved to Philadelphia in 2018, I went to a community screening of his documentary on the bombing of Osage Avenue. And so to be able to talk to him years later, especially given everything that's been going on at the Penn Museum, it was really a wonderful opportunity. Our episode focuses about his journey towards becoming a filmmaker, kind of his interest in storytelling and basically film and documentary film as like a medium for expressing stories and the kinds of community stories that he focuses on. His work through the Scribe Video Center, which is based in West Philly, which is a wonderful organization, which puts, media making tools in the hands of the community so that they can tell their own stories. And we conclude in Old City, where he worked on the installation at the President's House site at the Independence Hall complex and talking about the kind of politics that were involved in the making of that video installation, and the difference in working with actors for a scripted kind of moment versus the kind of documentary films that he's accustomed to making.
Great, thanks so much. And I'm going to play just a clip after each creator introduces. I'm just going to play a quick 2-minute clip of their episode so you can orient yourself.
Way we acquire things. It just was a revelation.
Louis' practice as a filmmaker is anchored by his participatory community media projects. He reflects on the early years at Scribe Video Center, cobbling together resources to support local activists in documenting and responding to some of the most pressing social issues of the 1980s in their own voice.
The idea of participatory community media is something that developed out of a response rather than saying, okay, I have this ideology and I'm going to create something based on the ideology. It was based really on a response. A lot of the work for me began through projects at Scribe.
Mm-hmm.
The first community work that happened at Scribe really was in the mid 1980s, when Scribe was really a place where people were coming to learn how to create work. And the mid 1980s, we're talking about the Reagan era still going on, and we're talking about a huge influx in homelessness and housing issues. Folks affiliated with Scribe, including myself, we would get calls from folks organizing around issues of housing and homelessness. Can you help us document this? Can you help us document that?
Mm.
And Scribe at that point was like an after work Saturday, Sunday kind of activity. I had a job during the day. We weren't a TV station. We weren't, we didn't even have equipment, to be quite honest. I mean, we were borrowing equipment from rental houses, so we didn't really have equipment.
Trying to get my, okay. Great. Just a second.
As well.
Right.
Okay. Great. And can I turn now to Adriana? Could you please introduce yourself and a little bit about your episode?
Hi, sure, yeah. Thank you for those introductions. Yeah, it was a big pleasure to talk to Hannah Mar and Ellie Clark, who formerly worked at PAFA. Now they've kind of gone in different directions. And I think what's really unique about that episode was that we got a pretty holistic picture of what putting together an exhibition looks like. Ellie Clark now, she moved to Mural Arts in Philadelphia. She's a director of project management, and Hannah Mar is now assistant curator at the San Jose Museum of Art. So, but he was also trained as an arts educator, which many people know often curatorial and educational departments and museums are kind of opposed. They're inward facing versus outward facing. So I think the two of those together, these two people, they really heard each other really well and talked about a lot of different things that since then, as I've gone on to work in different art institutions in Philly, I've really seen come to life. And so it was also like a foreshadowing moment for me. But yeah, we talked about labor was a big topic, and kind of the glamour of working in the arts, and kind of how the facade that it puts on, and actually all the effort and time that goes into putting exhibitions, and how that's not really seen when you walk into a museum or really any art space. And so I think it's really important when we're putting together any type of project that is very transparent. And I think that was what was great about that conversation, was we got to kind of show what was going on behind this huge project that seems to be very successful. So yeah, that's all I have to say for now. I guess we can play a clip from it.
Great, thanks. Sorry about that, everyone. It looks like it's just pulling up the old first episode. Can you guys hear anything when I was playing that?
A lot of people. A lot of people from the floor, or the ground floor, or the front lines are not being supported, are not being valued, and so they're trying to bring visibility to that.
I feel like maybe there is this feeling of responsibility that our institutions have more than perhaps nonprofit institutions that receive funding, because they are mission driven. But I think it's happening across, tech and many other industries, of just thinking about the ways in which we work and how productivity is not necessarily like an hours based thing. It's also part of your environment and feeling supported and feeling like you have space for creativity and having your company nurture those elements. And I think that is something a lot of industries are grappling with right now, because it just wasn't the norm. And we have.
Beautiful. Okay, great. Now, Anya, I would love it if you could say some things about your episode, as well as the work that you ended up conducting in Argentina.
Absolutely. So the episode that I did for this project, I co-created it with Vabene Elikem Piazzi, who's a Ghanaian performance artist who's also exhibited in Philadelphia as well as globally. And her work really revolves around gender stereotypes, trans identities, especially being in Ghana, which has recurring anti-LGBTQ plus legislation. So she works with queerness, with stigma, with Blackness, sort of at the intersection of all of these issues that deeply impact her. And so our episode really dove into the role of the artist and sort of raising public consciousness and being the sort of agent that can really get people to sort of see their beliefs, wake up to their emotions. And so she talks about sort of the intersection of art and life and how her performances are about her gender identity, and how there sort of is her ongoing performance of gender versus her art performance of gender and what that means. And we talk about some of her performances. And one thing that I found to be really interesting was the sort of emphasis on the power of silence. Most of her performances are done in complete silence. And she sort of explains that she does that because she doesn't want to contaminate the works, and that allowing sort of the work to be louder than herself, which I thought was really powerful. And she does say that, like, when she does break the silence, it's not just her voice, it's also the voice of other Black trans people. And she talks a lot about urgency, that grappling with the survival of LGBTQ folks, especially in regions where they're being persecuted. And so sort of saying that the time is now to do this work because of sort of how it's linked to survival and identity. Which is super powerful. I had a really good time with this episode, creating sort of these like soundscapes, which is something I hadn't really done before, which is really interesting in sort of creating this sort of emotion and this mood. So that was awesome. And then I loved it so much that in the summer of 2022, I spent 2 months living and working in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And while I was there, I did a project similar to this one, but working with artists mostly in Buenos Aires, but also outside of the city as well, throughout the rest of Argentina, discussing sort of their activism in art, what that looks like, taking up space in the city. I had a lot of episodes that were sort of responding to the last military dictatorship. And so there were a lot of issues with human rights. And so that was a really, really awesome project that I'm excited to bring out next March.
Beautiful. Let's hear from that first episode that you did that spurred your interest in doing a further season.
I think you have to unmute yourself, Alyssa.
Thank you. Sorry, not sure how that happened. Here you go.
So I am the art and I make the art. I create what I am and I am what I create. My life and my art is really interwoven and inseparable. So if you look at my work, I do not even see myself performing what I am. I do not see myself performing even the gender. I live it. So if I strip myself naked and go on the cross and put mud and clay on myself and chain on myself, I am literally speaking the same language that I speak as I dress and walk on the streets. And then other experiences that I will experience at the airport, at the border, stripped naked, beaten, and so on. I now just echo them in new expressions. So instead of being stripped by the securities at the airport, now I say, here I am. This is my body. This is your perversion. This is what you want to see. Your transphobia, your homophobic attitudes are nothing than perversions and self-hate. Now, quickly to give you a deeper explanation to that, between 2012 and 2014, there was much more visual distinction between some of my performances and my life. And then I realized that people were misreading what it means to be a trans person, to be a non-binary, and to be a queer person. So I was having confrontation from my family who said, yes, if you can only cross-dress on stage as a performance, then it is fine with us. But you cannot do this even at home. And you cannot take this to church. You cannot take this to town. It's unacceptable. And so from their religious debate and argument, I was asking them, if God so hates trans women and hates cross-dressing, why would God be silent when you are on stage as a trans person? So that means there's a moment for God to pardon sin and evil. And after that moment, then God resumed work to become a church. When you leave the stage, they don't expect you to continue to live your life as you. So these were some of the things that I had to escape by moving from the canvas into the street with my body. And when I felt that that was actually trapping me on actually looking at it, okay, this is a performance. So you can dress as a woman, as a performance artist.
Beautiful, thank you. So now what I want to do is pose a question to each of the panelists here and then open it up to questions from the audience, okay? So I guess, you know, I'm kind of, as a moderator, I'm very biased because I was also the one teaching the class. So my interests are not everyone's interests, but one thing I'm really interested in hearing from you about, Chrislyn, especially given your work with Louis Messiah, who's a very well-known figure in Philadelphia media history, and as an activist, is what do you think it offered to be in conversation with Louis directly, talking about his life and his emergence that wouldn't have been offered in, say, like an abstracted written analysis of the impact of Louis's work?
Yeah, I think something about just sitting down and talking to someone gives space for reflection in a different way where you're not maybe so focused on like the syntax maybe of the words that you're using. Editing this was really challenging for me because one, cutting it down to 15 minutes when there was so much material to work with. And Louis, when he speaks, he goes on all of these asides and they're all very rich and wonderful. And something that I noticed listening back to the recordings over and over again was just how much he would have to say about people. Even when the questions were more directed about him and his practice, he always found a way to bring others into the conversation. And I think, yeah, that was really beautiful to hear. And I don't think an essay would have, you know, resulted in the same kind of exploration or reflection.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think it really especially brings it makes sense in the context of Louis' artwork as well, and what Louis produced, that interest in people, and that pushing other people to the front of the narrative and being able to tell stories is such a crucial part of what he does. I know that there's a clip that portrays that very well. If you would like to be able to share that, Chrislyn.
Sure, I will attempt. Let's see if I can share my screen. Okay. Y'all, please let me know if you can hear this.
Assume to be from the community,
Mhm.
and there may not be a single antagonist.
Next stop, Fifth Street, Independence Hall, a wheelchair accessible station.
What you should be hearing that's not, I don't think it's coming in very well across, are these incredible sonic interludes that Chrislyn was able to create by traveling around the city of Philadelphia and going to places where Louis' work was on public display and public facing.
In the making of a new nation and community who insisted that the experiences of their enslaved ancestors be included at the historic site.
My initial appreciation of film was that narrative sense of scripted film. And it wasn't until later that I really began thinking of documentary as having a strong narrative potential as well. I was asked to work on the project, and my initial hope was like, is there some way to do this in a documentary mode that's going to work? And there weren't enough artifacts, there weren't enough documents, there weren't enough, the materials of documentary that I could envision that would work. This is an outdoor exhibition that is being seen by many times visitors to Philadelphia. And so you want something that's going to be engaging.
Right.
You want something that's going to be multi-generational in terms of the audience that you're talking to. So we actually had a chance to work with one of my most beloved and favorite people, actors on the planet, Novella Nelson. She died a few years ago, who I've known since my early 20s when I lived in New York. Just a really superb and extraordinary actor. And I have great respect for actors and what actors can do. It opens a whole other discussion about what is truth. How do you present something that is factual and true, and something that is contentious? Because some people, even as it was being built and as the project was going forward, really felt that to talk about enslavement on the land where George Washington lived is like, confusing.
I'll end it there.
Great, thank you so much. It just reminded me, listening to that, of how each of you guys really found these incredible voices yourselves, not just speaking with these artists and organizers, but you really channeled your own voices. And I remember everyone in class being so impressed with how you guys ended up sounding, and really finding an excellent way to communicate with people. And a lot of that doesn't necessarily come through in the final product, right? Like the work that you guys did in getting people to tell stories, or in learning about active listening and all of these processes, necessarily gets kind of backgrounded in the end product when we want to hear more from artists. But there's so much storytelling that you guys put into it. I would love to to offer a question now to Adriana, if I could. And I'm just wondering if there were any specific insights or lessons or revelations that emerged in your ongoing conversations about the exhibit. You do come from a background in arts exhibition, so I know you might have a really nice perspective, and it was great for you to be able to work with organizers and curators in this capacity.
Yeah, I think that One thing that was special about Rising Sun was that all of the artwork that was commissioned for the show is being acquired by the museums. And that is really rare in the art world, as Juan Omar talked about. And I think that gets largely unnoticed, especially like the actual labor of transporting art and like moving it from studio to here to there, and then, oh, this museum wants it for this show and it's across the country and the shipping costs are so much, let alone like coordinating all of that. And so, you know, I think that highlighted something that maybe could have been mentioned in like and it probably was mentioned in the press release and other materials for the show, but when you really look at that and you actually think about like what the artists were doing to prepare for this show and how much it's supporting them financially and economically, that makes it even more special, I think. So yeah, that was a really big revelation. I think also it was just great to talk to other like arts professionals and give them a chance to talk about like what it's like working in the industry. Because usually their voices are kind of, you know, behind this window of, you know, this is what we do, this is what we care about, we're excited for this and that. And then we don't really address the inequities in the art world until it's something big like people unionizing or something, or someone steps down or someone was exposed for this and that. And so which has been a lot of lately. And so we see that, but we don't see all the subtleties of like all of this extra, especially very emotional labor that goes into all this work. So I think that was really great to hear from them about that. And then also just like the history of museums and hearing from especially Juan Omar saying that decolonizing museums would require the abolition of museums. I think that was just a great line because it's true. And I think, you know, that's an ongoing effort that we're all kind of committed to, or at least trying to be more committed to. And acknowledging that there's a limit to that, and kind of working within the constraints that we have. It was really nice to hear that honesty around that. And so, yeah, and you know, creating more artist-centered practices that aren't just focused on work that artists are making, but actually the time that artists are putting into that work, and what they need to support their lives and their families and their well-being is just as important as their practice, because that also comes through in their art, which is something that we forget, is that, you know, they're making this incredibly vulnerable stuff, and if they can't support themselves, it's going to affect the material too, and that's often not really considered. But so yeah, those were a few of the things that really stuck out to me, and I'd be happy to elaborate on anything, but
that's fantastic. Actually, that segues exactly into my next question for Anya, which is about like emotional labor and artists. And I want to just put a pin in the fact that Anya's conversation with Vabene, as many of the conversations were, was a very emotional one that involved very real kinds of trauma and threat that had you grapple with ethical concerns, as well as what it means to be a caring participant in that kind of conversation. And although we can't hear your episodes yet, they'll be out next March, the ones you did in Argentina, they really take off from that as well. When you were sitting down with artists who had produced art about or during the dictatorship, and these were not easy questions. These are none of the work that any of you guys have done has been you know, neutral or abstract, right? It's been emotional and engaged. So what was that like, and how did you deal with that as an interviewer yourself?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's really interesting because, sort of going from what Adriana was saying, we don't often consider emotional labor as actual labor. And so it was really interesting to sort of see that develop with Fabene talking about in one of her performances. It was so emotionally involved and so physically dangerous that she actually had to declare her own death before beginning the performance, just in case something were to happen, because there was a real possibility. And we don't often think about those types of possibilities with sort of this with artwork, but it was real, and luckily she survived the performance. She was actually aided by passersby, which is something that happens a lot with her work, that you're turning the sort of spectator or the public into an actor, that also forces them to sort of wake up to their emotions and to question themselves and to fall into this sort of state of empathy. But yeah, that emotional sort of component of the end product isn't something that's always considered. And so also working with, shifting to the Argentina project, it was really interesting to sit down with a man who was exiled during the dictatorship and began to create sort of in response to the death of his brother who was killed by the military regime, and sort of the emotional toll of everything in his art production. But yeah, I think it's something that's widely overlooked when we consider sort of the end product is what we see, and we don't consider the emotional sort of toll and emotional labor that went into it in the first place.
Great. And I'm just going to prompt you one more time, because I would also like to hear how you, as an interviewer, like, what about the emotional work that you're putting in? How do you decompress from that? Like, how do you grapple with that?
Absolutely. Yeah. Sorry, I forgot about that piece of the question. I think with the Argentina project, I did struggle a little bit, specifically in responding, because while I do speak Spanish, I recorded all of the interviews initially in Spanish and then began with translating them. Sort of the same vocabulary of empathy that I had in English wasn't something that I necessarily had in Spanish. And so that was a piece that was a little bit difficult to navigate. And also, yes, going into these conversations, sort of not knowing what to expect, it's heavy as an interviewer. And it's also trying to figure out what to ask that's going to sort of produce this conversation while still remaining this level of respect for their art and for their privacy was sort of a line that I did my best to sort of dance around and to be on the right side of. But absolutely, the conversations were heavy for me as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Now I'd love to open it up to questions from the audience. You can raise a hand. You could post them and I'll ask them however you prefer. Yes, Lori.
I just want to congratulate you all on this podcast, and hearing the clips brought me back to the actual episodes, and the episode with Vabene was one I had to take on, and just, you know, I couldn't go to the next one. It actually, I was compelled to research Vabene's work and see the videos of her work and experiences and the story. So, but also just the voices just bring back memories. I think Louis Messiah is an excellent example of models of reckoning and repair that you really go deeply into. But I'm just wondering, what other models in Philadelphia have you learned about and are sharing in this podcast, or not yet shared, on reckoning and repair? That's my question.
Does one of you want to take that? Okay, Adriana, yes, great.
Yeah, I can just say briefly, I love Philadelphia's art scene because it's so community driven, and I think that's what sets it apart from a lot of other major cities. If I were doing another season of this podcast, I would love to go into detail with what every small gallery in the city does, and how they interact with each other, because I feel like, I don't know, it's very, you know, we, not just the museums, there's a lot of great work being done in museums, but also all these small artist collectives. It's a really, I think, magical interaction. And I just think, yeah, it'd be great if those voices can eventually be incorporated into conversations like this, because they're kind of left out of the art world. But yeah.
I agree. I think it's an exciting landscape, and And I don't have a lot of experience with other spaces, but the organic stuff that's happening in the community galleries and the collectives and the energizing of each other and just the supportive networks that are out there in Philadelphia is remarkable. And I also agree that the museum, certainly I consider it's one of the goals for my work at PAFA is to make sure that we create space for artists and to show work, but also to talk about their process and to talk about these connections. And so we can learn how to be together and how to work together.
And I'll just jump in and bring up Kristlyn, were you going to unmute yourself? Go ahead.
I was actually just thinking back to a collage workshop that I did at the Colored Girls Museum this past weekend. And I'd been meaning to visit the Colored Girls Museum for such a long time. And just being in that space, like I kept thinking over and over that this is what every museum should be like. It is very small, but it is very much like rooted in its community and like serves its neighbors. And like just one example I'm thinking of during the pandemic when students were doing Zoom school and they didn't have the opportunity, for example, to like do a picture day at school, and they opened their doors and like did portraits for like all of the kids in the neighborhoods for their families. And that's just like one example of like the really great work that they do there. So I think, that's another example.
And I was just going to plug the work of 12 Gates Art and Aisha Khan and her collaborators who we learned a lot about in three different episodes actually relate to the work that 12 Gates Art has done or connected to. And Aisha's really built with her fellow founders a model of an arts institution that's really oriented towards making art, towards paying for artists for their time, making space for artists so that art practice can be sustainable for them, and supporting that at a community-driven level, and doing tons of workshopping and open photo critiques that are kind and gentle and community engaged. I mean, it's just really great stuff too. And then I was going to plug as well that there are also other models which have more of, I don't want to call it cynicism, because I think there's a kind of optimism. There's a kind of real optimism in saying like, what comes next? What comes after the museum? And that's like what we see in Shada Soleimani's interview, where she says she's just really tired of conversations about reckoning and repair, and she doesn't want to have them anymore. And there is like no future for those conversations. So I think that there's a lot of making space for all of those different visions of what comes next. How do we move past this moment is really crucial, and not immediately starting from the position that like, okay, museums have to stay here in the same way that they are now. That can't be our starting point for this kind of conversation. We have to open up to other strange possibilities. No questions from the audience? I can just start on my question list. You guys feel free to post them in the meeting chat or raise a hand. Comments are also welcome. Okay, great. I'll just start with some questions. What do you think? One thing that we haven't really talked about that I think is really powerful about long form interviewing, and then the sort of short, concise stories that come out of it that you guys built. What do you think? How do you think oral histories and long form interviews that we don't hear all of, but like they exist? How do you think those inspire and empower listeners differently than other forms of engagement with artist work? Especially, I'm thinking here about those who've experienced social exclusion or racism themselves.
The first thing that comes to mind for me is that other than performance artists, for the most part, you don't know the artist's voice, you know their sort of production. And so having this sort of form of media as something that's accessible to audiences really brings that voice in, humanizes them in a way, as you can hear them. It's not just here's their work, here's their painting, here's whatever form of media that they use, but it really does bring in that sort of element of voice. And especially also with Vabene, seeing as most of her work, she mentions doing it in silence, that really hearing that voice sort of brings to life sort of her essence in a way.
Yeah, I think in a lot of written interviews, they tend to be edited and a lot is cut out. And that what gets cut out usually tends to be, I don't know, it's more, I don't know. I just think there's some power in hearing the more like a thought process behind like what someone is talking about. And it's just more raw for it to be like audio instead of written, especially when like, I don't know, a lot of, I mean, we come from Penn, like I think academic writing and artists are kind of forced to have this like academic voice and speak in a very high dialect that in some ways like kind of like washes away a lot of their authenticity and a lot of their own voice. And so I think having a chance for them to just sit down and talk about themselves, talk about their art, and not feel like they have to be like, oh, my work explores this and this as they would in an artist statement that's written down. I think that's a step in a direction that we really want.
And I'll also add, like, as someone who comes from a music background before like getting into the visual arts, like that sound is an art form as well, like not just in the form of speech, but all of the different ways that you can play around, you know, establishing a setting as human beings who move through space and like have embodied experiences, that's another way to engage the senses and maybe force people to slow down and pay attention in a different way than when you're looking, I guess.
Great. Actually, Kristen, I'd love it if you could say a little bit about your process in doing some of the sonic interludes. Like when you think about building sonic environments, I'm not just picking on Kristen because she's great, but she's also the graduate student on the panel. So I feel like you have a wealth of technique and strategy and history that you can draw from in answering these questions. But like, what are you looking for? How do you decide how to build a sonic environment like the ones you did in Louis' work? And like, what are you taking with you into the field?
Well, for me, it's just like before I even go out, I want to think about like my other just daily experiences moving around the city. As someone who did not grow up in Philadelphia, I have certain ideas and narratives that I've been taught about what this city is and what spaces are important, and thinking about what are the kinds of sounds that accompany like my daily movement through that space, and then how to tie it to the broader narrative that's happening. And then in terms of like the technical aspect, it really is just like having a microphone and some coverings and recording a bunch of stuff and then playing it back and seeing like what you can kind of cut together that tells a story, I guess, in and of itself. And a lot of luck, because sometimes you pick up things maybe that you don't want to include, but yeah.
Alyssa, if I may, I find that this discussion really, really wonderful about sonic landscapes, because in this show, both at AAMP and at Rising Sun, the artists are working in multimodal ways. There's so many soundscapes that are part of the installations that enrich the experience. So it is a the Rising Sun exhibition, it really has a deep and beautiful audio experience and at both museums. I'm thinking about Alison Sarr's water drippings and the sweeping sounds, you know, and the music and the compositions, the musical compositions that are part of the videos, and then the textures of your episodes. And I love the fact that, you know, the street sounds and your experiences woven into the conversation, because I think it's an invitation for others to identify with the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. I totally agree. That was what really excited me about Rising Sun, is just the extent to which it really felt like the artists were engaging in world building, which feels so appropriate to the prompts of the exhibit, but really multidimensional world building, not just as something you see, but like something that surrounds your entire body. That was really exciting. And I think that was one of the goals we had in the podcast, was like, what kinds of worlds can you build with sound? And since many of the students didn't have experience working in audio before, it was exciting just to see how far they came, I think, through engagement with artists' work, through really being participants and deep researchers on what artists were doing, really inspired them to make creative leaps. So thank you guys so much for joining us. I'm gonna just thank Lori here, and thank everyone at PAFA who was helpful and extended themselves in the course of the podcast, and especially to Vijay Duckett at AAMP, who's done such tremendous work on the exhibit and whose episode is really phenomenal. I really encourage you guys to listen to it. So thank you so much, Adriana, Kristlyn, and Anya. Stay tuned for season 2, which is going to be coming out next March. And get in touch if you have any comments or questions after the fact. And I'll turn it to Lori.
Yes, thank you for coming. I just wanted to know we're working with 12 Gates Arts on a program that's going to be on September 8th in partnership with their exhibition that's opening, titled something about partition memoir. We just had Shada here on an artist talk. She was amazing. So I'm going to post that on our YouTube channel this week, so you can check it out, because she is worth listening to the podcast and also listen to this talk. It's amazing. Stay tuned for more Rising Sun events, both at African American Museum in Philadelphia and at PAFA. Thank you, everyone. I'll be in touch.